Some chapters of the past remain unresolved despite decades of excavation, analysis, and debate. Scattered through ruins, archives, artifacts, and unexplained events are clues that have resisted simple interpretation. Each discovery opens another layer of uncertainty, challenging established assumptions and reshaping what scholars thought they understood. Settle in as we examine the evidence and the questions that endure. High above the hills of Samaria, the remains of ancient settlements lie scattered among terraces, stone walls, and weathered fields. The landscape is quiet now, but more than 27 centuries ago, it formed the heartland of a powerful northern kingdom. Its cities traded with neighboring states, its rulers maintained fortified centers, and its population lived within a political world documented by Assyrian inscriptions, biblical texts, and archaeological remains. Then, in the late 8th century BC, that kingdom suffered a devastating defeat. Around 722 BC, Assyrian armies captured Samaria after a prolonged campaign. The northern kingdom was dismantled, its political structures absorbed into the expanding Assyrian Empire, and portions of its population were deported. Assyrian royal records describe campaigns, conquests, and population transfers, providing one of the clearest historical foundations for the story. Yet, the fate of the people themselves is far less certain. Traditions speak of 10 tribes associated with the northern kingdom, communities whose identities had developed over generations. After the Assyrian conquest, their population appears to have been dispersed through different regions of the empire. Some were relocated eastward, while other inhabitants remained in their homeland and eventually became part of new communities shaped by centuries of cultural change. This is where the historical record becomes increasingly difficult to follow. Unlike royal dynasties, military campaigns, or monumental buildings, ordinary populations rarely leave behind continuous records tracing their movements across generations. Names change, languages evolve, communities merge, religious traditions adapt. A people can remain present while the identity by which earlier generations knew them gradually disappears from written history. Over time, the disappearance of clear records gave rise to one of antiquity's most enduring historical puzzles. What happened to the 10 tribes? The conventional explanation is dispersion. Their descendants may have been absorbed into populations living throughout the Assyrian territories, eventually losing distinct tribal identities. From this perspective, there was no single migration, no secret destination, and no dramatic disappearance. Instead, assimilation occurred gradually, making the original communities increasingly difficult to identify. But centuries later, traditions began pointing toward distant lands. Medieval writers associated the tribes with regions stretching far beyond Mesopotamia. Some accounts placed them somewhere beyond the great rivers of the East. Others connected them with communities in Central Asia, Persia, India, or even farther regions. Jewish travelers and scholars recorded stories of isolated populations claiming descent from these ancient groups, although the historical evidence behind many of these traditions remains uncertain. Modern theories have expanded the possibilities even further. Some researchers and cultural traditions have proposed connections between the ancient tribes and communities such as the Pashtuns, the Bene Israel of India, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, and other populations whose traditions contain narratives of migration or ancestral links to the biblical tribes. Genetic studies have tested some of these claims, sometimes finding intriguing regional connections, but such evidence rarely establishes a direct descent from a specific ancient tribe. The difficulty lies in the enormous passage of time. Nearly 3,000 years separate modern communities from the Assyrian conquest. During that interval, populations migrated, intermarried, adopted new languages, changed religious practices, and experienced the rise and collapse of successive empires. Establishing an unbroken line of descent across such a vast historical landscape is extraordinarily difficult. And yet, the persistence of these traditions remains significant. Why did stories of the 10 tribes continue to appear across distant regions? Were they echoes of genuine migrations that left few written traces, or did later communities adopt these traditions to explain their own origins? Could fragments of the original populations have survived in places that historians have not yet been able to identify with certainty? The archaeological record provides pieces. Ancient texts provide others. Oral traditions preserve memories that may reach deep into the past, but separating inherited history from centuries of interpretation remains a formidable task. Somewhere between the documented Assyrian deportations and the later traditions of distant communities lies a story that remains incomplete. The people did not necessarily disappear. Their recognizable identity may simply have become absorbed into the wider populations of the ancient Near East. And perhaps that is the most enduring question surrounding their fate. How much of an ancient people can survive after their name? The landscape of Central Asia changes gradually from fertile plains into a harsher world of open steppe, dry valleys, and distant mountain ranges. Somewhere within this vast frontier, in the summer of 530 BC, one of the ancient world's most influential rulers met his end. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, had spent decades transforming a regional kingdom into an immense power stretching across much of Western and Central Asia. Yet, the circumstances surrounding his final campaign remain uncertain. The transition from the previous mystery could hardly be more fitting. The fate of entire populations can disappear into incomplete records. So too can the final moments of a ruler whose name became inseparable from one of antiquity's greatest empires. Cyrus had conquered an extraordinary range of territories. His victories over the Medes, Lydia, and Babylon had established Persian authority across vast distances, while his reputation among later writers portrayed him as both a formidable conqueror and an unusually pragmatic ruler. But in his final years, his attention turned toward the eastern frontier, where the nomadic Massagetae occupied lands beyond the empire's established heartlands. What happened next is disputed. The principal ancient account comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century after Cyrus's death. According to his narrative, Cyrus entered the territory of the Massagetae and eventually confronted forces led by their queen, Tomyris. After an initial Persian victory achieved partly through a calculated trap, the Massagetae regrouped and defeated the main Persian army. Cyrus himself was killed during the fighting. Herodotus presents the episode with considerable detail, including the dramatic claim that Tomyris later ordered Cyrus's severed head to be placed into a container of blood, declaring that he had been given his fill of blood. It is a striking story, but historians have long recognized that Herodotus was not an eyewitness. His account was shaped by traditions circulating generations after the event, and the dramatic details may reflect the storytelling conventions of Greek historical literature. Other ancient sources offer very different versions. The Greek writer Ctesias, whose works survive only through later quotations and summaries, reportedly gave another account of Cyrus's death, associating it with a different campaign and different circumstances. Xenophon, meanwhile, presents Cyrus dying peacefully in his palace at old age in the Cyropedia, a work that is partly historical and partly philosophical, making it difficult to treat as a straightforward record. Even more intriguing is the evidence associated with Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae. The monumental structure still stands on a broad plain in southern Iran, composed of a simple stone chamber elevated above a stepped platform. Ancient writers identified it as the tomb of Cyrus, and later Persian traditions preserved the association. Yet, the monument itself provides no clear account of how the king died. If Cyrus was killed in battle against the Massagetae, why do other traditions describe a peaceful death? If Herodotus preserved a genuine memory of the campaign, how much of his dramatic narrative was later embellished? And if the final battle occurred far from the Persian heartland, what happened to Cyrus's remains before they were supposedly brought back to Pasargadae? Some theories have attempted to reconcile the conflicting accounts by suggesting that Cyrus may indeed have died during a campaign against a northern or northeastern people, while the precise identity of his opponents and the circumstances of the battle were later transformed by different traditions. More speculative interpretations have proposed that the Massagetae episode may have been confused with another conflict, or that political and literary motives influenced the surviving narratives. The evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. A great ruler who left an empire behind should, in theory, have left a clear record of his final days. Instead, the historical trail divides into competing accounts, each preserving fragments of a story that cannot be confidently reconstructed. At Pasargadae, the tomb attributed to Cyrus still stands beneath the open sky, silent and remarkably austere. The monument survives, but the final chapter of the man's life remains contested. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not simply where Cyrus died, but which version of his death preserves the closest memory of what actually happened, and how much of that final campaign still lies beyond the surviving record. The stone reliefs and inscriptions at Behistun rise from a sheer limestone cliff in western Iran, their carved figures overlooking an ancient route through the Zagros Mountains. High above the ground, the Persian king Darius I is portrayed standing over defeated figures, while a long inscription records the events that brought him to power. Among those figures lies one of the most disputed identities in Persian history, a man known as Gaumata, whom Darius accused of impersonating Bardiya, the brother of Cambyses II. The uncertainty surrounding him follows naturally from the disputed death of Cyrus the Great. His son, Cambyses, inherited an expanding empire, but after Cambyses died in 522 BC, Persia entered a period of extraordinary instability. A claimant appeared, a king was proclaimed, and within months the political order had changed completely. According to Darius, the central figure was Gaumata, a Magian priest who claimed to be Bardiya. Bardiya was the younger son of Cyrus the Great and brother of Cambyses. Darius's account states that Cambyses had secretly ordered Bardiya's death before leaving Persia for Egypt. Because the killing was concealed from much of the empire, Darius claimed, Gaumata was able to exploit the confusion. He supposedly resembled Bardiya closely enough, or possessed enough knowledge of the royal household, to convince people that he was the legitimate prince. For several months, Gaumata ruled as king. Then Darius and a group of Persian nobles organized a conspiracy. They entered the royal residence, killed the man identified as Gaumata, and placed Darius on the throne. At first glance, the sequence appears straightforward, but the entire narrative depends heavily on Darius himself. The Behistun inscription is our principal source for the story, and Darius had powerful reasons to justify his seizure of the throne. He needed to demonstrate that his predecessor was an impostor, that the legitimate royal line had been preserved, and that his own accession was lawful. The inscription therefore presents Gaumata not simply as a rival, but as a deceiver whose removal restored order to the empire. Yet historians have long examined another possibility. What if the man Darius called Gaumata really was Bardiya? This interpretation remains controversial, but it raises an important historical problem. If Bardiya had actually survived Cambyses' alleged assassination attempt and later claimed the throne, Darius's account would have served a very different political purpose. The supposed impostor would instead have been a legitimate member of the Achaemenid royal family. Ancient sources outside the Persian tradition add further complications. Herodotus broadly follows the story of a Magian usurper, describing a priest who allegedly exploited the resemblance to Bardiya. But his account was written decades after the events and includes details that cannot be independently verified. There is also the question of how successfully such a deception could have been maintained. Bardiya had been a member of the royal household. He would have been known to court officials, soldiers, nobles, and servants. Could an unrelated priest truly have convinced enough people to accept him as the king's son? Or had political circumstances already created an atmosphere in which the distinction between legitimate ruler and impostor became difficult to enforce? Perhaps the most revealing evidence is not the identity of Gaumata himself, but the political chaos that followed his death. Across the empire, revolts erupted. Different regions challenged Persian authority, while Darius fought a series of campaigns to consolidate his position. This suggests that the crisis was larger than a simple palace conspiracy. The throne itself had become the center of a struggle over legitimacy. Some modern interpretations therefore view the episode as a genuine usurpation. Others see Darius's story as carefully constructed political justification. A smaller number of theories suggest that the historical reality may have contained elements of both. Perhaps a real claimant existed, but later Persian records reshaped his identity and motives. At Behistun, Darius's inscription still dominates the cliff face, preserving his version of events in stone. But stone can preserve a statement without proving that every statement is true. Was Gaumata truly a Magian who impersonated Bardiya, as Darius insisted? Was he actually Bardiya himself? Or did the struggle involve competing claims whose original details were transformed by the victors? More than 2.5 millennia later, the inscription remains, the names remain, and the political consequences are clear. Yet, the identity of the man who briefly occupied the Persian throne still stands at the uncertain boundary between royal history and political memory. Beyond the eastern frontiers of the Persian Empire, the landscape opens into vast grasslands where rivers cut through dry plains and distant mountains fade into the horizon. This was the world of the Massagetae, a confederation of steppe peoples whose exact homeland remains debated. Into this uncertain landscape came Cyrus the Great during the final campaign of his reign, and at the center of the surviving account stands a formidable queen named Tomyris. Her story follows naturally from the disputed death of Cyrus and the political turmoil that followed his final campaign. Yet Tomyris belongs to a different kind of historical uncertainty. Unlike Darius's detailed inscription at Behistun, there is no monumental record created by her court, no surviving decree written in her name, and no known royal archive preserving her perspective. Almost everything we know about her comes from later writers. The most detailed account comes from Herodotus, who describes Tomyris as the queen of the Massagetae, a people living somewhere beyond the northeastern frontier of the Persian world. According to his narrative, Cyrus attempted to bring the Massagetae under Persian control. When diplomacy failed, the two sides prepared for confrontation. Herodotus presents Tomyris as an intelligent and determined ruler. Cyrus initially used deception to gain an advantage, leaving behind a camp filled with provisions and wine. The Massagetae, unfamiliar with the drink, reportedly consumed it, allowing Persian forces to attack them while they were incapacitated. Among those captured was Tomyris's son, Spargapeses. According to the account, Spargapeses later took his own life after realizing what had happened. Tomyris then demanded that Cyrus withdraw. When he refused, the final battle took place. The Massagetae defeated the Persian army, and Cyrus was killed. Herodotus adds the most dramatic detail of all. He claims that Tomyris found Cyrus's body, ordered his head severed, and placed it into a container filled with blood, declaring that the Persian king had received the blood he desired. It is a powerful image, but how much of it belongs to historical memory, and how much to literary storytelling? Herodotus wrote many decades after Cyrus's death. His descriptions of foreign peoples were often shaped by oral traditions, cultural assumptions, and dramatic narrative structure. The episode may preserve a genuine memory of a conflict between Persia and a steppe population, while individual details may have changed considerably through transmission. Other ancient sources complicate the picture. Ctesias provides a different account of Cyrus's death, while Xenophon describes an entirely different ending in which Cyrus dies peacefully in his palace. Later traditions offer still more variations. The disagreement is significant because Tomyris' story depends almost entirely on one version of events. There is also uncertainty surrounding Tomyris herself. Her name appears in Greek historical tradition, but no contemporary inscription has securely identified her. Archaeology has revealed much about the cultures of the Eurasian steppe, yet connecting a particular burial, settlement, or royal object to Tomyris remains impossible. Some later traditions have attempted to locate her realm more precisely, associating the Massageta with areas around the Caspian Sea, Central Asia, or regions farther east. Modern scholarship generally places them somewhere within the broader steppe zone, but their precise political organization and territorial boundaries remain difficult to reconstruct. Could Tomyris have been a historical queen whose reputation expanded through generations of storytelling? That remains plausible. Could the confrontation with Cyrus have occurred broadly, as Herodotus describes, while the famous revenge scene developed later? That possibility has also attracted scholarly attention. More speculative traditions have treated Tomyris as a symbol of resistance against Persian expansion, suggesting that her story may have been preserved because it offered a compelling reversal. The great imperial conqueror defeated not by another empire, but by a woman leading a steppe people. Yet symbols can preserve history while also transforming it. Somewhere between the archaeological record, Persian imperial history, and Greek storytelling stands a queen whose voice has not survived independently. We know the name Tomyris. We know the empire she supposedly confronted. We know that Cyrus died during an eastern campaign, but the precise circumstances connecting these events remain uncertain. Was Tomyris truly responsible for the defeat of Cyrus, as Herodotus claimed? Did later storytellers shape her into the avenging queen remembered today? And if her own people left records that could answer these questions, how much of that evidence remains undiscovered? Along the banks of the Halis River, in what is now central Turkey, the landscape stretches between rugged hills and broad valleys. More than 25 centuries ago, this frontier marked the uneasy boundary between two powerful kingdoms, Lydia in the west and the Median Empire farther east. Here, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, armies gathered for a battle that ended not with victory, but with darkness. The story connects naturally with the mystery of Queen Tomyris. Once again, the ancient world gives us a conflict in which the historical record preserves the outcome more clearly than the circumstances surrounding it. But this time, the event was not remembered for the death of a king or the triumph of a warrior. It was remembered because the sky itself seemed to intervene. The battle is generally dated to May 28, 585 BC. Lydian forces under King Alyattes had been fighting the Medes, led by Cyaxares, in a prolonged struggle whose origins are not entirely clear. According to Herodotus, neither side had achieved a decisive advantage after years of conflict. Then, during the battle, the daylight suddenly disappeared. The sun was obscured. The armies reportedly laid down their weapons and sought peace. To modern observers, the event sounds almost theatrical. Yet, unlike many legendary signs recorded in ancient literature, this particular eclipse has attracted serious attention from historians and astronomers because its date can be calculated with considerable precision. A total solar eclipse did indeed pass across Anatolia on May 28, 585 BC. That coincidence is remarkable. It does not, however, automatically prove every detail of Herodotus's account. The historian wrote many years after the event, relying on earlier traditions that have not survived independently. His chronology may have been preserved accurately, or it may have compressed different events into a single memorable episode. The central question is therefore not whether an eclipse occurred. It did. The deeper question is whether the eclipse actually brought the battle to an end. From a modern perspective, the reaction of the armies is plausible. A total solar eclipse can transform daylight into an eerie darkness within minutes. Temperatures may fall, shadows behave strangely, and the appearance of the sky can become deeply unsettling. For people living in a world without a scientific explanation for such an event, the sudden disappearance of the sun could easily have been interpreted as a divine warning. But ancient peoples were not unfamiliar with eclipses. Babylonian scholars had developed sophisticated methods for predicting celestial events, and knowledge of astronomical cycles circulated widely through the ancient Near East. Whether soldiers on the battlefield possessed such knowledge is another matter. Even if court astronomers understood the phenomenon, the sight of the sun disappearing during combat could still carry enormous political and psychological weight. Herodotus says the eclipse prompted both sides to stop fighting. A peace agreement followed, sealed by a marriage between the Median prince Astyages and the Lydian princess Aryanis. The consequences were significant. Yet uncertainties remain. Was the eclipse predicted beforehand by priests or astronomers? Did the armies truly interpret it as a divine warning? Or did an already exhausting conflict simply reach a natural point for negotiation, with the eclipse becoming the memorable event later associated with the settlement? Some modern reconstructions have examined the eclipse's exact path to determine whether the battlefield described by Herodotus would have experienced sufficient darkness. Calculations generally support the possibility, although uncertainty remains regarding the precise location of the battle and how the ancient chronology was constructed. More speculative interpretations have suggested that the event may have been deliberately anticipated by religious authorities and used to influence the opposing armies. There is no firm evidence for such a scenario, but the possibility reflects a broader reality of ancient warfare. Celestial phenomena could carry political meaning far beyond their physical causes. The image that survives is therefore remarkably simple. Two armies stood facing one another. Steel and dust filled the battlefield. Then the sun disappeared. Whether that darkness truly ended years of warfare, or whether later historians transformed an eclipse into the decisive moment of peace, remains difficult to determine. The calculations can tell us when the sky darkened. They cannot tell us exactly what the soldiers believed as they watched it happen, and that part of the story remains suspended between astronomical certainty and historical uncertainty. The ruins of Haran rise from the dry plains of northern Mesopotamia, where broken stones and scattered foundations mark the remains of a city that once stood at the crossroads of powerful empires. Here, near the end of the 7th century BC, the remnants of the Assyrian state made one final attempt to survive. At its center stood a ruler whose final fate remains uncertain, Ashur-uballit II. The uncertainty surrounding his story follows naturally from the eclipse battle. Once again, the surviving record tells us more about the political consequences of an event than about the fate of the people caught within it. But in the case of Ashur-uballit II, Even the final chapter of the ruler's life is difficult to establish with confidence. Ashur-uballit II emerged during the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful states of the ancient Near East. By the late 7th century BC, however, Assyria had been weakened by years of warfare. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BC marked a devastating turning point, but it did not immediately end Assyrian resistance. Surviving Assyrian forces regrouped farther west, establishing their remaining political center at Haran. It was here that Ashur-uballit II appears in the historical record. His name is preserved primarily in Babylonian sources, which describe him as an Assyrian king who continued the struggle against the expanding forces of the Babylonian king Nabopolassar and his allies. His position was precarious. The Assyrian heartland had been devastated. Nineveh had fallen, and the empire that once stretched across much of the Near East was rapidly contracting. Yet Haran remained strategically important. Its location connected Mesopotamia with Syria and the wider western regions. Control of the city offered the Assyrians a final opportunity to preserve their dynasty and maintain a political foothold. In 610 BC, Babylonian forces captured Haran. Ashur-uballit II did not disappear immediately. Ancient sources indicate that he retreated toward the western frontier, where he sought assistance from Egypt. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II had his own reasons for supporting the remaining Assyrian forces. A strong Assyria could serve as a buffer against Babylonian expansion. The armies returned to Haran in 609 BC, but the attempt failed. Babylonian forces once again secured the city, and the last organized Assyrian resistance appears to have collapsed. Then the historical trail becomes almost silent. No surviving contemporary source gives a reliable account of Ashur-uballit II's death. We do not know with certainty where he died, how he died, or whether he escaped the battlefield and lived elsewhere. His final resting place has never been securely identified. That silence is remarkable. For centuries, Assyrian kings had commissioned inscriptions celebrating their victories, recording campaigns, constructing monumental buildings, and presenting themselves as rulers favored by the gods. But Ashur-uballit II ruled at the very end of that tradition, when the institutions capable of preserving such records were already collapsing. The conventional interpretation is that he died during or shortly after the final Assyrian resistance in 609 BC. Some historians have suggested that he may have been killed in battle, while others allow for the possibility that he survived the destruction of the Assyrian cause. The surviving sources simply do not provide enough information to settle the matter. Later traditions have occasionally inspired more speculative possibilities. Perhaps he fled farther west. Perhaps he sought refuge among allied communities. Perhaps he was captured and executed by his enemies. There is no strong evidence confirming any of these scenarios. Archaeology has also struggled to locate the final traces of his reign. Haran contains evidence of repeated destruction, rebuilding, and occupation, but separating the remains associated with Ashur-uballit II from the broader layers of the city's long history is difficult, and perhaps that is what makes his disappearance so fitting. The last king of a civilization renowned for its archives left behind remarkably little about his own final moments. His empire collapsed in stages, his capital was destroyed, his remaining armies were defeated, and eventually even the record of the ruler himself faded. Did Ashur-uballit II fall with the last Assyrian army at Haran? Did he escape into the western lands? Or did the final king of Assyria simply disappear into a world that no longer had a reason to record his fate? The stones of Haran remain, but they have not yet answered. The ruins of Nineveh lie beside the Tigris, where broken walls and weathered reliefs preserve fragments of a city that once stood at the center of the Assyrian Empire. Its palaces were covered with scenes of conquest, tribute, hunting, and royal ceremony. Among the rulers who shaped this formidable capital was Sennacherib, a king remembered for his military campaigns, monumental building projects, and an unusually complicated end. His death connects naturally with the disappearance of Ashur-uballit II. Both belonged to the final centuries of Assyrian power, yet Sennacherib died long before the empire itself collapsed. His final moments, however, remain surrounded by competing accounts. Sennacherib ruled from 705 to 681 BC and transformed Nineveh into an extraordinary imperial capital. He expanded its walls, constructed monumental palaces, and developed an extensive system of canals and aqueducts to supply the growing city with water. His inscriptions proudly recorded campaigns throughout the Near East, presenting the king as a ruler whose authority reached far beyond Assyria itself. But his reign also produced powerful enemies. Among the most important was Babylon, where resistance to Assyrian control repeatedly challenged imperial authority. Sennacherib responded with military force, eventually destroying Babylon in 689 BC. The destruction was severe, and later traditions remembered the event with particular bitterness. Several years later, Sennacherib was dead. The Babylonian Chronicle records that in 681 BC, Sennacherib was killed by one of his sons. The account is brief, but later sources provide more detail. A biblical narrative describes the Assyrian king being killed while worshiping in the temple of his god by two of his sons, who then escaped to another land. For generations, this account created an apparent contradiction. Who killed Sennacherib, and why? Modern Assyriology has added important evidence. Inscriptions from the reign of Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon indicate that a violent struggle occurred within the royal family. Esarhaddon later described his brothers as having turned against him and claimed that he was chosen to succeed his father. The political circumstances suggest a succession crisis. One plausible reconstruction is that Sennacherib's sons participated in his assassination because they were competing for the throne. Yet, the precise motives remain uncertain. The surviving sources were written from the perspective of the victorious faction, meaning that they naturally emphasize legitimacy and divine approval. The identities of the assassins are also complicated. The biblical tradition names Adramelech and Sharezer, while Assyrian evidence preserves different forms of the royal family names. Scholars have attempted to reconcile these traditions with inscriptions from the period, but uncertainties remain over exactly which individuals participated in the killing. Then there is the question of where the assassination occurred. The biblical account places Sennacherib inside a temple, while the Babylonian source simply records his death. Assyrian inscriptions provide no surviving eyewitness description of the event itself. The palace reliefs show the king as an all-powerful monarch, but none captures the moment when his reign ended. The aftermath may be even more revealing. Esarhaddon eventually became king, but his accession was not peaceful. He later described fleeing westward and gathering support before returning to seize the throne. His inscriptions portray this struggle as part of a divinely ordained succession, but behind the official language lies evidence of a serious internal conflict. Some later theories have proposed that Sennacherib's assassination was connected directly to his destruction of Babylon. Perhaps one or more of his sons feared the political consequences of their father's policies. Others suggest that personal rivalries within the royal household were more important than religious or ideological motives. These interpretations remain possibilities rather than established facts. What is certain is that Sennacherib did not die on a distant battlefield or during a foreign campaign. The evidence points toward an internal act of violence at the heart of the Assyrian royal family. A king who had survived rebellions, wars, and countless military campaigns ultimately met his end within his own political world. The irony is striking. Sennacherib spent his reign constructing monuments designed to preserve his achievements for eternity. His reliefs and inscriptions still allow historians to reconstruct much of his world. Yet, the final scene of his life remains incomplete. Who delivered the fatal blow? What truly motivated the conspirators? And how much of the story was later shaped by the political faction that inherited his throne? Nineveh preserves the monuments of Sennacherib, but the precise circumstances of his death remain partly concealed within the silence between the surviving records. The northern shores of the Black Sea open into an immense landscape of grasslands, river valleys, and windswept plains. For centuries, these routes connected the peoples of the Eurasian steppe with the kingdoms of Anatolia and the Near East. Somewhere within this vast frontier lived the Cimmerians, a people remembered in ancient records as formidable horsemen who appeared suddenly in the historical narrative, and then became increasingly difficult to trace. Their story follows naturally from the fate of Sennacherib. Once again, the ancient Near East preserves accounts of powerful peoples and violent conflicts, but the further we move from the centers of empire, the harder it becomes to reconstruct the lives of those who left fewer written records. The earliest references to the Cimmerians place them somewhere north of the Black Sea, although their exact homeland remains debated. Assyrian inscriptions from the 8th century BC mention a people called the Gyges, generally identified with the Cimmerians. These records reveal that they were not simply a legendary population. They were active participants in the political and military struggles of the ancient Near East. Their arrival was disruptive. According to Assyrian sources, the Cimmerians moved southward into Anatolia, where they came into contact with powerful kingdoms. Their migrations may have been connected to conflicts with the Scythians or to broader movements among steppe populations, although the precise causes remain uncertain. By the 7th century BC, Cimmerian forces were appearing in regions far from their presumed homeland. They attacked the kingdom of Urartu, threatened Phrygia, and eventually reached Lydia. One of their most famous victories came around 696 BC, when they defeated the Phrygian king Midas, a ruler whose name later became associated with legends of extraordinary wealth. The Cimmerians continued to raid and fight across Anatolia, yet their historical presence begins to fade almost as quickly as it appeared. Assyrian records describe encounters with Cimmerian leaders, including a figure named Teushba, who was defeated by the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit. Other sources describe Cimmerian attacks against Lydia and the death of the Lydian king Gyges during one such conflict. Then, after a period of intense activity, the name becomes increasingly rare. Where did they go? The simplest explanation is assimilation. The Cimmerians may have been a collection of mobile groups rather than a centralized kingdom. Their communities could have merged with other steppe populations, adopted new political identities, or dispersed across the regions they entered. This would explain why archaeology has struggled to identify a single material culture belonging exclusively to them. The problem is that ancient writers often treated peoples such as the Cimmerians as distinct ethnic groups, while their actual social organization may have been much more fluid. A group could change its alliances, language, and identity over generations, without leaving behind a clear archaeological boundary. Some scholars have therefore questioned whether the apparent disappearance represents a real demographic event at all. Perhaps the Cimmerians simply ceased to be recognized under that name. There are also more speculative theories. Some traditions have attempted to connect the Cimmerians with later populations of Europe or Central Asia, suggesting that they survived under different names and eventually contributed to other peoples. Linguistic similarities and ancient geographical references have sometimes been used to support such ideas, but the evidence is far from conclusive. Even their homeland remains uncertain. Classical writers place them in different regions, while archaeological evidence from the northern Black Sea demonstrates extensive movement and cultural interaction among steppe populations during this period. Distinguishing Cimmerian settlements from those of neighboring groups remains one of the major difficulties. What makes their story particularly compelling is the contrast between their historical impact and their archaeological obscurity. The Cimmerians fought major kingdoms, crossed enormous distances, and influenced the political landscape of Anatolia. Their name appears in royal inscriptions and classical histories, yet there is no clearly identified Cimmerian capital, no securely located royal cemetery belonging to their ruling dynasty, and no surviving archive explaining their movements. They seem to have entered the historical record through conflict and then gradually dissolved from it. Perhaps they were absorbed into Scythian communities. Perhaps remnants settled among Anatolian populations. Perhaps different Cimmerian groups continued for generations under entirely different names. The ancient texts give us glimpses, but not a continuous story. And somewhere between the northern steppe and the kingdoms of Anatolia, a people once feared by kings ceased to appear as a recognizable force. Their warriors left traces in the records of others, but their own voice has not survived. Were the Cimmerians truly destroyed as a distinct people, or did they simply become someone else? The answer may still lie scattered across the vast landscapes they once crossed, waiting for evidence capable of reconnecting the fragments. Along the banks of the Pactolus River, the ruins of Sardis rise from the fertile plains of western Anatolia. Once the capital of Lydia, the city was surrounded by monumental buildings, wealthy sanctuaries, and workshops associated with the earliest widely used coinage. At the center of this prosperous kingdom stood Croesus, a ruler whose immense wealth became legendary, and whose final fate remains wrapped in conflicting traditions. His story offers a fitting continuation from the Cimmerians. The same Anatolian landscape that witnessed the movements of nomadic warriors also became the stage for the rise and fall of one of the ancient world's wealthiest monarchs. Yet Croesus's downfall was not caused by a mysterious disappearance or an unknown enemy. It was the uncertainty surrounding what happened to him after the fall of Sardis that has kept his story alive. Croesus ruled Lydia during the 6th century BC, probably from around 560 to 546 BC. Under his reign, Sardis became a major political and commercial center. Lydia controlled important routes through western Anatolia, and its rulers possessed access to the region's natural resources, including the gold-bearing sands associated with the Pactolus. Croesus's wealth became so famous that his name eventually entered common language as a symbol of extraordinary riches. But wealth did not protect Lydia from the ambitions of Cyrus the Great. As Persian power expanded westward, Croesus confronted Cyrus around 547 or 546 BC. The Lydian king expected to defend his kingdom successfully, but after the Battle of Sardis, Persian forces captured the city. According to Herodotus, this was the moment when Croesus's fate became extraordinary. The Lydian king was supposedly placed upon a funeral pyre, either by Cyrus himself or by Persian soldiers acting under his authority. As the flames began to rise, Croesus remembered the Greek philosopher Solon and cried out his name. Cyrus, according to Herodotus, asked why he had done so. Croesus then explained Solon's warning that no man should be called fortunate until the end of his life. The Persian king, moved by the lesson, ordered the fire extinguished. Then, according to the story, rain began to fall, extinguishing the flames. Croesus survived. It is a compelling narrative, but it is also difficult to verify. Other ancient traditions offer different endings. Some accounts suggest that Croesus was executed. Others indicate that he survived and became an advisor to Cyrus. Still, others provide variations in which the Lydian king lived long enough to witness the beginning of Persian rule. This disagreement is important because Herodotus's account is not simply a record of events. It also carries a moral structure. Croesus begins as the embodiment of wealth and power, only to learn that prosperity can disappear in an instant. His survival then reinforces the larger lesson that fortune remains unpredictable until the end. Could this have happened? Perhaps. Cyrus was known through later traditions as a ruler capable of incorporating defeated kings into his political system. Keeping Croesus alive could have been practical, especially if his knowledge of Anatolia and his prestige among the Lydians remained useful. Archaeological evidence confirms the Persian conquest of Sardis and the transformation of Lydia into part of the expanding Achaemenid Empire. But archaeology cannot tell us whether Croesus stood before a burning pyre, whether Cyrus ordered his rescue, or precisely how the king spent his final years. Some later interpretations have suggested that the pyre story may have developed from older Near Eastern traditions about royal defeat and divine intervention. Others argue that Herodotus preserved a genuine memory of Croesus's capture, later shaping it into a dramatic philosophical episode. The exact circumstances remain uncertain. What seems more secure is that Croesus's kingdom ended. Sardis passed into Persian control, and the Lydian monarchy ceased to exist as an independent power. Yet, the fate of the man himself remains suspended between history and tradition. Did Cyrus spare Croesus and retain him as a counselor? Was the Lydian king executed after all? Did he live quietly under Persian rule, far removed from the wealth and authority that had defined his reign? The Pactolus still flows through the landscape of Sardis, while the remains of the ancient capital lie beneath the Anatolian sky. The gold that made Croesus famous can still be traced through the archaeology of the region, but the final chapter of his life remains less certain. A king remembered for possessing everything ultimately became famous for losing it. And perhaps the most enduring uncertainty is whether the surviving story records Croesus's actual fate, or a later generation's attempt to give meaning to the fall of a man who had once seemed almost untouchable. The dry landscape of western Syria and northern Mesopotamia stretches toward the horizon, crossed by ancient routes that once connected Persia with Egypt. Somewhere along these roads, in 522 BC, a Persian king died under circumstances that would soon become entangled with rebellion, disputed succession, and accusations of deception. His name was Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. His story provides a natural continuation from the fate of Croesus. The Lydian king's downfall demonstrated how quickly political fortunes could change under Persian expansion. But Cambyses inherited something far greater than Lydia. He inherited an empire still growing, and his own death would create one of its most serious crises. Cambyses became king after the death of Cyrus in 530 BC. During his reign, Persian power reached Egypt, where Cambyses defeated the pharaoh Psamtik III and established Persian control over the country around 525 BC. Egyptian sources and later traditions present Cambyses in very different ways. Some portray him as a capable conqueror. Others describe acts of violence and religious hostility. Herodotus, writing more than a century later, gives particularly dramatic accounts of the king's behavior in Egypt, including stories of desecration and cruelty. Yet, separating historical events from later literary traditions remains difficult. What is clearer is that Cambyses eventually left Egypt and traveled back toward the eastern part of his empire. The reason for his departure appears connected to a growing political crisis. According to the Behistun inscription of Darius I, while Cambyses was away, a man named Gaumata seized the throne by claiming to be Bardiya. Cambyses' brother. Darius later insisted that Cambyses had secretly ordered Bardiya's death before leaving Persia. When Cambyses learned of the rebellion, he attempted to return. He never reached the heartland of the empire. The circumstances of his death are recorded differently in ancient sources. Herodotus states that Cambyses accidentally wounded himself in the thigh while mounting his horse. The wound became infected, and he died soon afterward. The Babylonian Chronicle gives a much shorter account, recording that Cambyses died in Syria while traveling. The difference may seem minor, but it leaves an important question unanswered. Was Cambyses' death really an accident? Herodotus himself reports that Cambyses had previously experienced a vision concerning his brother Bardiya. The king supposedly became afraid that Bardiya would overthrow him and ordered his death. Later, when news reached Cambyses that someone claiming to be Bardiya had taken the throne, the king realized the danger. If Darius's account is correct, Cambyses was racing home to confront an impostor. But Darius had a political reason to present events this way. His own accession depended upon establishing that Bardiya was dead and that Gaumata had unlawfully seized power. Cambyses' death therefore became part of a larger narrative of legitimacy. There is another possibility. Cambyses may have died from an accidental wound exactly as Herodotus described. Ancient medicine had limited ability to treat serious injuries, and an infected wound could become fatal. A relatively ordinary accident could therefore have ended the life of an emperor without requiring assassination. Yet uncertainty persisted because Cambyses died at precisely the moment when the Persian succession was collapsing. His brother was supposedly dead. A new ruler occupied the throne. Revolts erupted across the empire. And within months, Darius and several Persian nobles had killed the man identified as Gaumata. The political circumstances invite suspicion. Could Cambyses have been assassinated by rivals who needed him removed before returning to Persia? Could his death have been exaggerated or deliberately misrepresented after the succession crisis? Or did a genuine accident simply occur at the worst possible moment for an empire already approaching political turmoil? No surviving contemporary account provides a definitive answer. Archaeology offers little help. There is no securely identified tomb containing Cambyses, no surviving royal record describing his final moments, and no independent eyewitness testimony capable of resolving the contradictions. Even his burial remains uncertain. Some traditions suggest that Cambyses was eventually interred according to royal custom, but the evidence is insufficient to establish the location with confidence. His death therefore stands at the intersection of accident, political violence, and historical memory. The Persian Empire survived him, but the uncertainty surrounding his final days became part of the foundation story of the next dynasty phase. A wound from a horse, an illness, a possible assassination, or a political narrative constructed after the fact. Each possibility occupies a different place in the surviving evidence. And somewhere between those accounts lies the final journey of Cambyses II, a king who conquered Egypt but never returned to the center of the empire he inherited. Did he truly die from an accidental wound on the road through Syria, or did his enemies have another reason to ensure that he never reached Persia? The surviving records preserve the question, but not the answer. High in the Zagros Mountains, where rugged valleys descend toward the Iranian plateau, the city of Hamadan occupies a landscape long associated with one of the least understood powers of the ancient Near East. Ancient writers called the city Ecbatana, the supposed royal center of the Medes. Yet, beneath the modern streets, remarkably little remains that can be securely identified with the great Median kingdom described in classical histories. That uncertainty makes the Medes a fitting continuation of the story of Cambyses II. The Persian Empire that Cambyses inherited did not emerge in isolation. Long before Cyrus the Great transformed Persia into an imperial power, another Iranian-speaking kingdom had occupied a central position in the political world of Western Asia: the Medes. According to Herodotus, the Median kingdom was established by Deiochus, who supposedly united scattered Median communities and founded a royal capital at Ecbatana. His successor, Phraortus, allegedly expanded Median territory, while Cyaxares transformed the kingdom into a major military power. Under Cyaxares, Herodotus describes the Medes joining forces with the Babylonians against the Assyrian Empire. Their campaigns contributed to the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BC, one of the decisive events that ended Assyrian dominance. For a time, the Medes appeared to stand among the great powers of the ancient Near East. But then the evidence becomes difficult. The principal narrative comes from Greek sources, especially Herodotus, writing generations after the events he described. Persian royal inscriptions rarely present the Medes as an independent empire in the elaborate form later historians imagined. Instead, they reveal a complex political landscape in which Median nobles, rulers, and territories clearly existed, but the precise structure of their kingdom remains debated. Archaeology has deepened the uncertainty. Excavations in western Iran have uncovered impressive settlements, fortifications, pottery traditions, weapons, and elite burials associated with the Iron Age. Sites such as Tepe Nushijan provide valuable evidence for Median period culture. Yet, no excavated capital has conclusively revealed the administrative machinery of an enormous centralized empire comparable to Assyria or later Persia. Even Ecbatana remains elusive. Ancient authors describe it as a magnificent royal city surrounded by concentric walls, but the modern city of Hamadan occupies the location traditionally associated with it. Centuries of occupation have obscured much of the earlier settlement, making it extremely difficult to determine exactly what the Median capital looked like during the 6th and 7th centuries BC. Then comes the most important turning point. Around 550 BC, Cyrus the Great defeated Astyages, the last Median king according to Herodotus. The Median kingdom was absorbed into the emerging Persian Empire, but the transition may not have been as simple as a conquered people being completely replaced. Median nobles appear to have retained important positions within the new Persian political order. Median soldiers served within Persian armies, and Median traditions continued to influence the culture and administration of the Achaemenid world. This raises a fundamental question. Was the Median Empire truly a centralized imperial state, or was it a powerful confederation of regional rulers whose political influence was later enlarged by Greek historians? Some scholars have argued that the traditional picture of a vast Median empire stretching across much of western Iran should be treated cautiously. Others maintain that the archaeological and textual evidence does support a substantial Median political formation, even if its exact institutions remain unclear. More speculative interpretations have gone further, proposing that the Medes may have controlled territories traditionally attributed to other powers, or that later Persian historians deliberately minimized their importance. Such ideas remain difficult to establish because the surviving evidence is fragmentary and often comes from sources written after the Median kingdom had already disappeared as an independent political entity. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the Medes did not simply disappear. Their political identity may have been absorbed into the Persian state. Their elites may have entered the new imperial hierarchy, while their language, customs, military traditions, and regional influence continued in altered forms. In that sense, the Median kingdom may have ended politically without disappearing culturally. The ruins and scattered archaeological evidence provide fragments, while the ancient historians provide a narrative that cannot always be independently confirmed. Between them lies an empire whose existence is certain in some respects, yet whose size, structure, and historical influence remain surprisingly difficult to define. Was Ecbatana truly the magnificent capital described by the classical writers? How extensive was Median power before the rise of Persia? And when Cyrus defeated Astyages, did an empire truly collapse, or did one political order simply transform into another? The answers remain incomplete, leaving the Median Empire suspended between archaeological evidence, ancient tradition, and the possibility that much of its story still lies beneath the cities and landscapes of western Iran. Along the eastern bank of the Tigris, the vast mound of Kuyunjik rises above the surrounding plains, marking the heart of what was once Nineveh. Today, grass and scattered ruins cover much of the site, but more than 26 centuries ago, this was the monumental capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Its palaces displayed enormous stone reliefs, its archives contained thousands of clay tablets, and its walls enclosed one of the most formidable cities of the ancient Near East. Yet, in 612 BC, Nineveh fell. The collapse was so dramatic that later generations remembered it as one of the great turning points of the ancient world. But the circumstances of its destruction are more complicated than a single battle. The city that had dominated the region for generations did not simply disappear overnight. Its fall was the culmination of military pressure, political instability, and perhaps environmental factors that remain debated. The story connects naturally with the mystery of the Median Empire. The Medes were among the forces that participated in the campaigns against Assyria, and their role in the destruction of Nineveh has been preserved in both Babylonian records and later historical traditions. By the late 7th century BC, Assyria was already under enormous pressure. Its empire stretched across vast territories, requiring constant military campaigns to maintain control. Rebellions had become increasingly common, while powerful rivals were emerging in the east and south. The death of Ashur-uballit around the middle of the 7th century BC appears to have been followed by a period of internal instability and succession disputes. Then the balance of power shifted rapidly. The Babylonian king Nabopolassar established an independent dynasty in Babylon and began challenging Assyrian authority. At the same time, Median forces under Cyaxares moved westward. The two powers eventually formed an alliance against Assyria. Their target was Nineveh. Assyrian sources describing the final catastrophe are surprisingly limited. Much of what we know comes from Babylonian chronicles and later classical writers. These records indicate that the city was besieged in 612 BC and eventually captured after intense fighting. But exactly how the final defenses failed remains an area of debate. One traditional interpretation holds that the attackers breached the city's defenses through military force after a prolonged siege. Another possibility is that flooding played a role. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, preserved a tradition that exceptionally heavy rains caused the Tigris to swell, damaging part of the city's defenses and allowing the attackers to enter. This account has generated considerable discussion. Nineveh was protected by massive walls and earthworks, and the Tigris itself formed part of the city's natural defensive environment. Could unusually high water have weakened the fortifications at a critical moment? Some modern interpretations consider the possibility plausible, although the evidence is insufficient to establish that flooding was decisive. The Babylonian accounts provide a different emphasis, focusing on military operations and the defeat of the Assyrian king. What is clear is that Nineveh was destroyed with considerable violence. Archaeological excavations have revealed layers of burning and destruction dating to the period of the city's fall. Weapons, damaged structures, collapsed walls, and abandoned buildings provide physical evidence that the final assault was severe. But destruction does not explain everything. Why did the Assyrian Empire collapse so quickly after centuries of expansion? One explanation is overextension. The empire had become dependent on continuous military pressure to maintain its territories. Once several enemies coordinated their efforts, the Assyrian system may have been unable to respond effectively on multiple fronts. Another factor was internal political instability. Rival claimants and succession disputes weakened central authority at precisely the moment when external enemies were becoming stronger. There may also have been economic and environmental pressures. Large imperial capitals required enormous resources to sustain their populations and armies. Changes in agricultural productivity, regional instability, or disruptions to trade could have placed additional strain on the state. These factors do not necessarily contradict one another. Nineveh may have fallen because several weaknesses converged at the same moment. Yet there is another intriguing aspect of the story. Nineveh was not simply a military capital. It was a center of knowledge. Ashur-banipal's library preserved thousands of tablets containing literature, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, administrative records, and religious texts. The survival of this material is one of the great archaeological legacies of the city. The destruction of Nineveh, therefore, did not erase Assyrian civilization completely. Instead, fragments survived beneath the ruins. Some later traditions describe the fall of the city in almost moral terms, portraying the destruction as punishment for Assyria's violence and imperial ambition. These interpretations became especially influential because of later biblical traditions concerning Nineveh. But historians must distinguish such literary and theological interpretations from the physical evidence of the archaeological record. The city itself offers a more complicated story. After 612 BC, Nineveh ceased to function as the great imperial capital it had once been. Yet, the surrounding region remained inhabited, and political power did not disappear from Mesopotamia. Babylon became the dominant center of the region, while the remnants of Assyrian resistance continued farther west. The fall of Nineveh was therefore not the instantaneous disappearance of an entire people. It was the collapse of a political system that had once seemed almost impossible to defeat. And perhaps that is where the deeper uncertainty begins. Was Nineveh destroyed primarily because of military conquest? Or did internal weakness make the city vulnerable long before the final siege? Did flooding genuinely contribute to the breach of its defenses? Or did later historians transform a complex assault into a more dramatic explanation? And how much of the destruction visible in the archaeological layers represents the final battle itself? The answers remain incomplete. Today, the mounds of Kuyunjik and the surrounding ruins offer only fragments of what once stood there. The palace reliefs still depict kings hunting lions and receiving tribute, while thousands of tablets preserve the ordinary workings of an empire that believed its power could endure. Yet, within a few years, that world had collapsed. Nineveh had not merely been defeated. It had become a ruin, leaving historians to reconstruct its final days from chronicles, broken walls, burned layers, and scattered pieces of evidence. The city fell in 612 BC. The precise chain of events that made its fall possible remains far less certain, and somewhere among those fragments may still lie the missing explanation for how one of the ancient world's greatest capitals finally met its end. High above the plain of Kermanshah, the monumental inscription of Behistun is carved into the face of a limestone cliff. Its relief shows Darius I standing over defeated enemies, while an immense multilingual inscription explains how he came to power. Among the names preserved, there is one at the center of a political crisis that shook the Persian Empire in 522 BC, Bardiya, the brother of Cambyses II. The story leads directly from the fall of Nineveh and the disappearance of Assyrian power to a very different kind of historical uncertainty. Here, the mystery is not the collapse of a city, but the fate of a royal prince whose death may have determined who ruled one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. According to Darius's account at Behistun, Bardiya was the younger son of Cyrus the Great and brother of Cambyses. Before Cambyses departed for Egypt, Darius claimed, the king secretly ordered Bardiya's death because he feared that his brother might eventually challenge his authority. The killing was supposedly concealed. Only a small number of people were said to know that Bardiya had been eliminated. This detail became crucial to Darius's explanation of what happened next. While Cambyses was still in Egypt, a man named Gaumata, described by Darius as a Magian priest, allegedly proclaimed himself king. According to the inscription, Gaumata claimed to be Bardiya. The deception apparently succeeded. Across the empire, people accepted the new ruler. Cambyses learned of the rebellion and attempted to return, but died before he could confront the claimant. Darius then entered the story. He and several Persian nobles supposedly discovered the deception, entered the royal residence, and killed Gaumata. Darius subsequently became king. At first, the sequence seems straightforward. A prince was secretly murdered, an impostor seized his identity, and Darius exposed the fraud. But there is a problem at the heart of the story. Nearly everything we know about the alleged murder of the real Bardiya comes from the men who benefited from his absence. Darius's Behistun inscription is an extraordinary historical source, but it was also a political document. Darius had seized the throne during a period of widespread rebellion. To establish his legitimacy, he needed to explain why Cambyses' brother was not the rightful king, and why Darius himself possessed the authority to rule. The distinction between Bardiya and Gaumata therefore became fundamental. If Bardiya was truly murdered before Cambyses left Egypt, then Darius's story makes political sense. Gaumata could have exploited the secrecy surrounding the killing and presented himself as the surviving prince. But what if Bardiya was not killed? This possibility has attracted serious scholarly attention, although it remains unproven. If the man executed by Darius and his allies was actually the legitimate Bardiya, then the events of 522 BC would look very different. Darius's accusation of impersonation could have been a justification for removing a genuine rival. The ancient evidence cannot decisively resolve the question. Herodotus, writing generations later, also describes a secret killing of Bardiya and a Magian who impersonated him. His narrative broadly supports the framework found in Darius's inscription. Yet Herodotus was dependent on traditions available to him, and his account contains dramatic details that cannot be independently verified. There is another difficulty. If Bardiya really was murdered in secret, how did Darius establish that the man later claiming to be Bardiya was an impostor? The very secrecy surrounding the original killing would have made the question of identity exceptionally difficult to prove. Perhaps Darius and the Persian nobles genuinely knew the truth. Perhaps the royal household had enough witnesses to identify the real prince. Or perhaps political authority itself became the evidence. The crisis spread rapidly. Revolts erupted across the empire, and Darius spent the early years of his reign fighting to suppress them. His Behistun inscription presents these rebellions as the consequence of lies spread by enemies and impostors. Yet, the scale of the unrest suggests that many groups were willing to challenge the new ruler. That fact has encouraged alternative interpretations. Some historians have suggested that the widespread support for the so-called Gaumata may indicate that he was more than a fraudulent priest. Perhaps he represented a legitimate faction within the Persian royal family. Perhaps the population was responding to policies associated with Cambyses and the established elite. Or perhaps the entire episode involved a succession struggle that Darius later reduced to a simple story of deception. More speculative theories have gone further, proposing that Bardiya survived Cambyses' alleged assassination order and genuinely became king. Under such an interpretation, Darius's accession would resemble a coup against a legitimate ruler, rather than the restoration of rightful authority. There is, however, no conclusive evidence proving this scenario. The name Gaumata remains attached to the alleged impostor in Darius's account, but even his identity is difficult to reconstruct independently. No surviving inscription written by Gaumata has been discovered. No contemporary royal archive explains his background in his own words, and the supposed murder of Bardiya left almost no physical trace. No securely identified tomb marks the location of his burial. No surviving document records the execution. No independent witness account has survived to tell us what happened inside the royal household. All that remains is the political aftermath and the version preserved by the man who ultimately occupied the throne. At Behistun, Darius presented the story in stone as a matter of certainty. Bardiya was dead, Gaumata was an impostor, and Darius was the legitimate restorer of order. But history sometimes leaves its most difficult questions precisely where certainty was most important. Was the real Bardiya secretly murdered by order of his brother, allowing an ambitious priest to exploit the confusion? Was Gaumata genuinely an impostor? Or did Darius construct a story that transformed the killing of a legitimate rival into the execution of a fraud? The cliff at Behistun preserves Darius's answer. What it does not preserve is Bardiya's voice. At the edge of the Iranian plateau, where dry mountains give way to broad valleys and old caravan routes, traces of one of history's most influential religious traditions can still be found. Fire temples, inscriptions, ritual objects, and later manuscripts preserve fragments of a faith centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda. Yet, behind that tradition stands a figure whose historical identity remains remarkably difficult to establish: Zoroaster. The uncertainty surrounding him follows naturally from the disputed identity of Bardiya. In both cases, later generations preserved a powerful tradition while leaving historians with surprisingly little contemporary evidence. But unlike Bardiya, whose name appears in royal inscriptions, Zoroaster left no securely dated monument bearing his name and no contemporary biography that can be independently verified. His identity therefore begins with the texts attributed to his religious tradition. At the heart of Zoroastrianism are the Gathas, a collection of poetic hymns preserved within the Avesta. These compositions are traditionally regarded as the words of Zoroaster himself, and they provide the closest surviving material to the historical person. But even the Gathas create problems. They are written in an extremely old form of Iranian language known as Gathic Avestan. Their precise date remains debated, and scholars have proposed widely different periods for their composition. Some place Zoroaster several centuries before the rise of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, perhaps somewhere in the 2nd millennium BC. Others argue for a later date, closer to the early 1st millennium BC. This uncertainty has profound consequences. If Zoroaster lived many centuries before Cyrus the Great, then his teachings emerged in a religious world very different from the Persian Empire known from classical history. If he lived later, he may have been closer in time to the political traditions that eventually shaped Achaemenid Persia. Yet, the historical record provides no definitive answer. Later Zoroastrian texts contain biographical traditions about Zoroaster, describing his birthplace, family, teachers, visions, and encounters with rulers. The Denkard and other Middle Persian works preserve stories about his life, but these texts were compiled many centuries after the period in which he is believed to have lived. They cannot simply be treated as contemporary biography. According to later tradition, Zoroaster was born into a priestly family and received a revelation from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of his religious system. He then began teaching a distinctive vision of cosmic morality, emphasizing truth, righteousness, personal responsibility, and the struggle between constructive and destructive forces. The teachings were influential, but the geography of his life remains uncertain. Traditional accounts place important events in eastern Iranian regions, while later interpretations have connected him with areas ranging from northeastern Iran to Central Asia and Afghanistan. There is no universally accepted birthplace. Why does this matter? Because identifying the landscape in which Zoroaster lived could transform our understanding of the world that shaped his ideas. Geography can reveal political connections, neighboring cultures, trade routes, and religious traditions that may have influenced his teachings. Yet, the evidence remains elusive. One of the most important clues lies in the language of the Gathas. Their vocabulary and grammar suggest a linguistic environment connected to the older Iranian languages of Central and Eastern regions, rather than the later Persian language of the Achaemenid court. This has led many scholars to place Zoroaster somewhere in the broader Eastern Iranian cultural sphere. But language alone cannot provide a precise date or location. The Achaemenid kings later invoked Ahura Mazda in their royal inscriptions. Darius I famously attributed his authority to the god, while Xerxes and other rulers continued the tradition. This demonstrates that ideas associated with Zoroastrian religious culture were influential within the Persian imperial world. It does not, however, prove that the Achaemenid kings practiced Zoroastrianism in exactly the form later traditions describe. That distinction is important. The religion evolved over centuries. Ritual practices changed, priestly traditions developed, and sacred texts were transmitted orally before being compiled in written form. By the time much of the Avesta was recorded, countless generations had passed since Zoroaster was believed to have lived. Some later traditions may preserve genuine memories. Others may reflect theological development. More speculative theories have proposed that Zoroaster was not a single historical individual, but a composite figure representing a long religious tradition. This interpretation remains outside the mainstream, because the Gathas contain a strong first-person voice that appears to reflect an individual teacher. Still, the absence of contemporary evidence leaves room for debate about how much of the later biography belongs to the original figure. Even his name presents complexities. The Greek form Zoroaster derives from the Iranian name Zarathustra, whose meaning and linguistic development have been debated. The different forms of the name reflect the transmission of his story through multiple languages and cultures. Perhaps that is the central difficulty. The religious tradition attributed to Zoroaster survived for thousands of years, yet the man himself remains difficult to place within a precise historical framework. A teacher whose words were preserved through generations may have lived in a world of pastoral communities, regional rulers, and competing religious traditions. His ideas eventually influenced one of the ancient world's major civilizations, but the precise moment and place where those ideas first emerged remain uncertain. Was Zoroaster a Bronze Age religious reformer, an early 1st millennium BC prophet, or a figure whose teachings evolved through generations before being attributed to a single teacher? The Gathas preserve a voice. Later traditions preserve a life. But the distance between those two forms of memory remains difficult to cross, leaving the identity of Zoroaster suspended between linguistic evidence, religious tradition, and the fragments of an Iranian past that has yet to reveal its full chronology. Along the northern edge of the Nile Delta, the landscape opens into fertile fields, waterways, and the remains of cities that once guarded Egypt's eastern frontier. Here, during the 6th century BC, Pharaoh Apries ruled a kingdom caught between powerful neighbors and growing internal tensions. His reign began with military ambition, but ended in civil conflict, defeat, and a death whose circumstances were recorded by later historians with unsettling clarity. The uncertainty surrounding Apries follows naturally from the question of Zoroaster's identity. Once again, the surviving evidence preserves fragments of a distant world, while leaving important details to later interpretation. But unlike Zoroaster, Apries belonged to a well-documented royal dynasty, and his final years can be reconstructed through Egyptian evidence and Greek historical accounts. Apries, known in Egyptian sources as Wahibre, ruled during the 26th dynasty, probably from 589 to 570 BC. His reign came during a period when Egypt was attempting to preserve its independence, while the great powers of the Near East competed for control of the region. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II posed a major threat to Egyptian interests. Egyptian forces became involved in conflicts along the eastern Mediterranean, while Apries sought to strengthen Egypt's influence beyond the Nile Valley. But military setbacks would eventually turn against the pharaoh himself. According to Herodotus, Apries sent an Egyptian army to confront Greek forces in Cyrenaica, in modern Libya. The expedition ended disastrously. Many Egyptian soldiers were killed, and those who survived returned convinced that Apries had deliberately sacrificed them. Whether this accusation was justified is uncertain. The defeat, however, created a serious political crisis. The surviving soldiers rebelled against the pharaoh and proclaimed a military commander named Amasis as their ruler. Apries responded by sending additional forces against the rebellion, but the conflict escalated into a struggle for the Egyptian throne. Amasis eventually defeated Apries. The former pharaoh was captured. What happened next is where the surviving accounts become particularly revealing. Herodotus states that Apries was handed over to the people of Sais, where he was killed by strangulation. His body was then buried in a royal burial place associated with the Temple of Neith. The story presents a ruler destroyed not by an invading empire, but by political forces within his own kingdom. Yet, the Egyptian evidence adds another dimension. Amasis did not simply erase Apries from history. He presented himself as the legitimate successor and continued important traditions of the 26th dynasty. Inscriptions from his reign acknowledge the previous royal order while emphasizing his own authority. This suggests that the transition may have been more politically complicated than a simple popular uprising. Apries had powerful supporters, particularly among sections of the military and elite. Amasis, therefore, had to consolidate authority carefully. He could not simply destroy every institution associated with his predecessor without destabilizing the kingdom further. The fate of Apries' body is also significant. Ancient sources indicate that he received a burial, despite the violent circumstances of his death. This suggests that the new regime may have recognized a degree of continuity with the old monarchy, even after overthrowing its ruler. But was Apries truly killed by his own subjects? The mainstream interpretation accepts that he was overthrown and executed after the civil war. Herodotus's account is consistent with the broader political evidence, and the rise of Amasis is historically well established. Still, the exact sequence of events remains less certain. Some details in Herodotus's narrative may reflect Egyptian traditions transmitted to Greek visitors generations after the events. The historian was writing long after Apries' reign, and his account combines political history with explanations of character, motive, and fate. There is also the larger geopolitical background. Egypt was surrounded by competing powers. Babylonian expansion, Greek mercenaries, Libyan territories, and internal Egyptian factions all influenced the kingdom's stability. The rebellion against Apries may therefore have been the result of several pressures converging rather than a single military failure. His death became a symbol of political reversal. A ruler who had commanded armies and controlled one of the ancient world's oldest kingdoms ultimately found himself powerless before the people he once governed. Later traditions remembered Apries as a warning about the dangers of military ambition and political arrogance. But historians must separate those moral interpretations from the evidence itself. Archaeology has confirmed the importance of Apries' reign. Remains associated with his building projects survive, while inscriptions and monuments demonstrate the continued strength of Egyptian royal culture during his rule. Yet, no archaeological discovery has provided a definitive account of his final moments. The most compelling evidence remains textual. Herodotus preserves the story of defeat, rebellion, capture, and execution. Egyptian sources reveal the subsequent legitimacy claimed by Amasis. Between these records lies a period of political upheaval that cannot be reconstructed in every detail. Was Apries' downfall caused primarily by his military failures, or had deeper divisions already weakened his authority? Did Amasis rise as the representative of a genuine popular movement? Or did powerful elites use the army's dissatisfaction to seize the throne? And how closely does the surviving account of Apries' execution reflect what actually happened? The Nile Delta still preserves the landscape in which these events unfolded, but the political world of Apries has long disappeared. His reign ended in rebellion, his throne passed to a rival, and his death became part of the turbulent final centuries before Egypt was absorbed into the great imperial struggles of the ancient Near East. Yet, beneath the official histories remains a quieter uncertainty. Whether the final fate of Pharaoh Apries has truly been reconstructed, or whether the surviving accounts preserve only the version that the victorious regime was willing to leave behind. The ruins of Sardis lie beneath the hills of western Anatolia, where the Pactolus River once flowed beside the capital of Lydia. Columns, stone foundations, and remnants of monumental structures reveal a city that became one of the wealthiest centers of the ancient world. Long before Croesus transformed its wealth into legend, another Lydian king occupied the throne, Candaules. His reign, and the rise of his successor Gyges, survive through one of antiquity's most unsettling royal stories. The account fits naturally after the downfall of Pharaoh Apries. Once again, the subject is a ruler whose position appeared secure until an internal crisis transformed the political order. But in the story of Candaules, the surviving tradition revolves around something more personal: trust, secrecy, humiliation, and a violent transfer of power. Candaules is traditionally regarded as the last ruler of the Lydian Mermnid dynasty's predecessor, the Heraclid line. He probably ruled during the early 7th century BC, although the chronology remains uncertain. Almost everything known about him comes from Herodotus. According to the historian, Candaules was convinced that his wife was the most beautiful woman in the world. He repeatedly praised her appearance to one of his bodyguards, a man named Gyges. The king eventually insisted that Gyges secretly observe the queen while she undressed, supposedly so that the bodyguard could confirm his judgment. Gyges resisted. He reportedly considered the request improper and dangerous, but Candaules insisted. Eventually, Gyges entered the royal chamber unseen and observed the queen, but the queen noticed him leaving. The following day, according to Herodotus, she confronted Gyges privately. Rather than immediately expose him, she offered him a choice: kill Candaules and become king, or die himself. Gyges chose survival. That night, he entered the royal chamber and killed Candaules while the king slept. He then seized the throne. It is one of the most famous stories in Greek historical literature, but its historical reliability is difficult to measure. The name Gyges is not purely legendary. Assyrian inscriptions from the 7th century BC mention a Lydian ruler named Gugu, generally identified with Gyges. These records provide an important independent indication that a powerful Lydian king bearing this name genuinely existed. The Assyrian sources describe him as a ruler of Lydia who sent tribute or diplomatic communications to the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit. They also place him within a period of significant political activity in western Anatolia. This creates an intriguing contrast. The basic existence of Gyges is supported by external evidence, while the dramatic circumstances of his rise come almost entirely from Herodotus. Could a palace coup really have occurred? Certainly. Royal assassinations were hardly unknown in the ancient world, and the sudden transition from one ruling house to another could involve violence. But whether the incident unfolded because of the queen's humiliation, as Herodotus describes, is impossible to establish. The story may contain a historical core surrounded by literary construction. Herodotus often used dramatic episodes to explore questions of power, pride, fate, and human behavior. The tale of Candaules fits this pattern remarkably well. The king's excessive confidence creates the conditions for his own downfall, while Gyges rises from subordinate to monarch through a single act of violence. The queen herself is another source of uncertainty. Herodotus does not preserve her name in this episode. Later traditions identify her as Nicaea, but this identification is not securely supported by contemporary evidence. The absence of her own voice leaves the central figure in the story almost entirely dependent on male-authored traditions. There is also an important political dimension. If Gyges really overthrew Candaules, the event may have represented more than a personal dispute. It could have involved competing factions within the Lydian court, military interests, or broader tensions surrounding the succession. The intimate story preserved by Herodotus may therefore conceal a much larger political struggle. Gyges' subsequent reign certainly mattered. He expanded Lydian influence and conducted campaigns against neighboring peoples, including Greek communities along the Anatolian coast. His reign also brought Lydia into contact with Assyria, demonstrating that the kingdom had become an important regional power. Yet, even the historical record surrounding his rule contains contradictions. The Assyrian sources portray Gugu as a distant ruler interacting with the Assyrian court, while Greek traditions remembered Gyges primarily as the man who seized the Lydian throne through murder. Which version is closer to reality? Perhaps both contain fragments. A genuine political transition may have occurred, while later storytellers transformed the complicated circumstances into a memorable tale of jealousy, secrecy, and revenge. The details could have been preserved through oral traditions long before Herodotus recorded them. More speculative interpretations have suggested that the story may preserve distorted memories of a dynastic conflict. The queen's role might have been exaggerated, while the actual coup involved military or aristocratic factions. Such possibilities cannot be proven, but they demonstrate how difficult it is to reconstruct political events from narratives shaped by later generations. At Sardis, the archaeological remains offer no direct answer. There is no inscription describing Candaules' death. No contemporary document records Gyges' accession in detail. The palace where the alleged murder occurred has not been securely identified in a way that could illuminate the event. What remains is an unusual combination of evidence. A historical ruler named Gyges confirmed indirectly by Assyrian records, a Lydian kingdom whose power is archaeologically visible, and a dramatic account of a royal murder preserved by a Greek historian centuries later. Did Gyges truly enter the king's chamber and kill Candaules after being forced to witness the queen? Was the episode a carefully shaped story built around a genuine palace coup? Or does the surviving tradition preserve only a distorted reflection of a more complicated struggle for the Lydian throne? The ruins of Sardis cannot tell us which version is closest to the truth. They only preserve the setting for a story in which a king's confidence, a queen's anger, and a soldier's ambition may have transformed the course of Lydia, and left historians still trying to separate memory from fact. High above the ancient road through the Zagros Mountains, the cliff at Behistun rises like a monumental wall of stone. Carved into its surface is one of the most important royal inscriptions of the ancient world. Darius the Great stands among defeated rebels, proclaiming how he became king and restored order to the Persian Empire. Yet, behind this official account lies a remarkable question. How did a relatively obscure Persian nobleman rise so quickly to the throne of the world's greatest empire? The question follows naturally from the story of Gyges and Candaules. Once again, a throne changes hands through violence, political uncertainty, and competing claims to legitimacy. But Darius's ascent was far larger in scale. His accession transformed not only the Persian monarchy, but the administrative and political structure of an empire stretching across 3 continents. The crisis began in 522 BC. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, had died while returning from Egypt. Shortly afterward, a man named Gaumata claimed to be Bardiya, Cambyses' brother, and assumed the Persian throne. Darius later declared that Gaumata was an impostor. According to the Behistun inscription, Darius and 6 other Persian nobles discovered the deception and killed Gaumata at a fortress called Sikayavatish. Darius then became king. But why Darius? He was not the obvious heir. He belonged to the Achaemenid royal family, but he was not a direct descendant of Cyrus in the same immediate line as Cambyses and Bardiya. His father, Hystaspes, had held an important position, and Darius himself had served in the royal administration and military. Yet his path to the throne required more than royal ancestry. It required a carefully constructed claim to legitimacy. Darius's own explanation was that he belonged to a branch of the Achaemenid dynasty and that the other claimants were rebels or impostors. The Behistun inscription repeatedly emphasizes his relationship with the royal house and his support from Ahura Mazda. The message is unmistakable. Darius did not present himself as a usurper. He presented himself as the rightful ruler restoring order after deception and rebellion. But the empire did not immediately accept him. Across the Persian territories, revolts erupted. Babylon rebelled. Elam challenged his authority. Media, Armenia, and other regions became centers of resistance. Darius claimed to have fought 19 battles and defeated 9 rebel leaders during the first year of his reign. Whether every detail should be accepted literally is debated, but the scale of unrest is undeniable. Darius's position was extremely fragile. A king who had just seized power needed to convince distant provinces, military commanders, aristocratic families, and subject peoples that his rule was legitimate. The Behistun monument became part of that effort. Its inscriptions were written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, allowing Darius's version of events to circulate across different administrative and cultural communities. The monument was not merely a historical record. It was a declaration of political authority carved into the landscape. Yet another uncertainty surrounds the famous story of how Darius became king. Herodotus describes a secret arrangement involving the conspirators after the killing of Gaumata. According to his account, the 7 nobles agreed that the next king would be determined by the behavior of their horses at sunrise. Darius's horse reportedly neighed first. Herodotus then explains that Darius's groom had secretly prepared the horse by using a mare to stimulate it beforehand. It is an extraordinary story, but was it history? The episode may preserve a memory of an aristocratic agreement surrounding the succession, while the horse story could represent a later explanation of divine favor and political destiny. Horses carried enormous symbolic importance in Iranian royal culture. So the narrative may have communicated legitimacy in a form ancient audiences readily understood. There is another possibility. Darius may have needed such a story because his accession was controversial. If the throne had been won through a coup, the new ruler required more than military strength. He needed a narrative explaining why his victory was justified. His marriage strategy also strengthened his position. Darius married members of the royal family, including Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, and other women connected with the Achaemenid house. These marriages reinforced his connection to the dynasty founded by Cyrus. But political legitimacy was only one part of Darius's achievement. Once his position was secure, he reorganized the empire. He established administrative divisions, standardized taxation, developed roads and communication networks, and expanded monumental centers such as Persepolis and Susa. The ruler who emerged from the succession crisis became one of Persia's most capable imperial administrators. Yet the question of his rise remains. Was Darius genuinely the legitimate heir who rescued the empire from a dangerous impostor? Was he a talented military commander who took advantage of a succession crisis? Or did the official version deliberately simplify a much more complicated struggle among Persian elites? The evidence does not provide a final answer. Behistun gives us Darius's voice in extraordinary detail. But history rarely preserves the voices of those who opposed him. The defeated rebels appear as names and figures carved into stone, while the new king controls the narrative. And that may be the most intriguing feature of Darius's rise. The monument created to establish his legitimacy has survived for more than 2,000 years. It tells us exactly how Darius wanted his accession remembered. But it cannot tell us exactly what happened in the rooms, courtyards, and military camps where the Persian throne was actually decided. Between the official inscription and the uncertain political reality lies the rise of a king who transformed a moment of crisis into one of the most enduring reigns of the ancient world, and whose path to power still leaves historians questioning how much of the story is history, and how much is the voice of the victor. Along the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, where desert meets fertile water and ancient trade routes converge, the remains of Egypt's maritime ambitions are scattered beneath centuries of shifting sand. More than 2,500 years ago, Pharaoh Necho II ruled from this region during one of Egypt's most turbulent periods. Yet, among his most intriguing projects was not a conquest on land, but an extraordinary expedition that may have sailed around the entire African continent. The story follows naturally from the rise of Darius the Great. As Persian power expanded across the Near East, Egypt remained strategically important, and rulers increasingly looked beyond the traditional boundaries of the Nile Valley. Necho II, who ruled from approximately 610 to 595 BC, inherited a kingdom determined to strengthen its influence over both land and sea. One of his most ambitious projects was the construction of a canal connecting the Nile with the Red Sea. The canal was never completed during his reign, but Necho also supported a maritime expedition that would become one of antiquity's most intriguing geographical accounts. The expedition itself is known primarily through Herodotus. Writing more than a century later, Herodotus states that Necho commissioned Phoenician sailors to explore the coastline of Africa. They supposedly departed from the Red Sea, sailed southward, continued around the continent, and eventually returned through the Mediterranean after roughly 3 years. If the account is accurate, these sailors accomplished something extraordinary. They would have navigated thousands of kilometers along unfamiliar coastlines, crossed regions where seasonal winds and currents could determine survival, and entered waters far beyond the normal range of Egyptian political activity. But Herodotus gives us almost no details about the expedition's individual ships, commanders, or precise route. There is no surviving logbook, no contemporary Egyptian inscription has been found describing the voyage. No identifiable harbor has been securely connected to the expedition. The entire account rests largely upon Herodotus's report. And yet, one detail has made the story especially compelling. According to Herodotus, the sailors reported that while sailing around Africa, the sun appeared on their right-hand side when they were traveling westward along the southern portion of the continent. To a modern reader, this detail is surprisingly significant. For sailors traveling south of the equator, the sun can indeed appear to the north during portions of the year. A northern observer describing such a phenomenon might have found it difficult to understand. Herodotus himself apparently regarded the detail as evidence against the sailor's story. Modern geography, however, makes the observation plausible. This has led many historians to regard the expedition as at least possible, and perhaps genuinely historical. But possibility is not proof. The route remains uncertain. Did the ships follow the entire African coastline? How did they obtain food and fresh water? Where did they stop during the long journey? How were the vessels repaired? And what happened during the months when they were out of contact with the societies of the Mediterranean and Near East? The ships themselves provide another clue. Phoenician sailors were highly experienced navigators, and their maritime networks extended across the Mediterranean. They possessed the skills necessary for long-distance coastal travel, while Egypt controlled access to the Red Sea through its eastern territories. Still, circumnavigating Africa would have been an undertaking on an entirely different scale. The southern tip of the continent presents powerful currents, changing winds, and difficult coastal conditions. A voyage around Africa would have required careful seasonal planning and remarkable endurance. Some modern researchers have attempted to reconstruct possible routes based on prevailing winds and ancient sailing technology. These reconstructions suggest that such a voyage was technically possible using vessels of the period. Other interpretations remain more cautious. Perhaps Herodotus preserved an authentic expedition, but misunderstood its route. Perhaps the sailors reached only part of the African coast before returning. Perhaps later oral traditions expanded a difficult exploration into a complete circumnavigation. There is also the question of why Necho would have ordered such a voyage. The expedition may have been connected to commercial ambitions, maritime exploration, or an attempt to understand the territories bordering Egypt's southern and western horizons. Necho's broader policies demonstrate an interest in expanding Egypt's strategic reach, particularly through naval power. Yet no surviving Egyptian record clearly explains his objective. That silence leaves room for interpretation. If the expedition truly circumnavigated Africa, why did no detailed geographical knowledge from the voyage survive in Egyptian records? Why does the account appear most clearly in a Greek historian writing generations later? And if the voyage never happened in the form described, why does Herodotus preserve such a specific detail about the position of the sun? The evidence remains frustratingly narrow. There are no confirmed shipwrecks that can be securely attributed to Necho's sailors. No inscriptions identify the explorers. No ancient map survives showing their route with certainty. What remains is a remarkable narrative suspended between historical possibility and incomplete evidence. A fleet leaves the Red Sea. It sails south along an unfamiliar coast, follows the eastern and southern shores of Africa, rounds a continent whose full scale was still poorly understood by Mediterranean societies, and eventually appears again in the Mediterranean world. Whether every part of this journey occurred exactly as Herodotus described cannot be established. But the possibility alone is remarkable. Perhaps the sailors completed the voyage and returned with knowledge that was never properly recorded. Perhaps their expedition reached far beyond conventional maritime horizons, but failed to leave a lasting trace. Or perhaps the surviving account preserves only fragments of a more limited exploration. The ancient coastline offers few answers, and somewhere between the Red Sea and the western shores of Africa lies the unresolved story of Necho's expedition, a voyage that may have crossed an entire continent's circumference, leaving behind little more than a few lines in an ancient historian's account. The coastline of western Anatolia fades into the distance beyond the ruins of Sardis, where the Pactolus once carried gold-bearing sediment toward the Lydian capital. Long before Croesus became synonymous with wealth, Lydia was ruled by Gyges, a king whose rise to power was wrapped in a tale of palace intrigue. Yet, the circumstances of his final years and the manner in which he met his death are far less certain. From the story of Necho II's distant expedition, we return to the political world of Western Anatolia, where geography and ambition shaped the fortunes of emerging kingdoms. Gyges ruled Lydia during the 7th century BC, probably beginning around 680 BC, and his reign marked the emergence of the Mermnad dynasty as a major force in the region. Unlike many rulers known only through later tradition, Gyges has an important connection to contemporary evidence. Assyrian records mention a Lydian ruler named Gugu, generally identified with Gyges. These inscriptions reveal that Lydia had entered the diplomatic and military calculations of the Assyrian Empire. Yet, the final chapter of Gyges' life is considerably harder to reconstruct. According to Assyrian records, Gyges sent envoys to Ashur-uballit, the powerful king of Assyria. He reportedly sent tribute and prisoners after receiving warnings concerning conflicts involving the Cimmerians, a mobile people who had entered Anatolia and created instability across the region. This detail provides an important historical setting. The Cimmerians were a serious military threat to several Anatolian kingdoms. Their movements contributed to political upheaval, and Lydia was forced to defend its territory against them. Gyges appears to have initially survived these pressures, but his relationship with Assyria later deteriorated. Assyrian sources indicate that Gyges supported or encouraged forces opposing Assyrian interests, possibly by sending military assistance to Egypt. The reasons remain uncertain. Perhaps the Lydian king believed Assyria's influence could be challenged. Perhaps he was attempting to expand Lydia's own position in the region. Whatever his motives, the decision carried enormous risks. Assyria was one of the most powerful states of the ancient Near East, and provoking its rulers could have serious consequences. Then the Cimmerians returned. According to Assyrian records, they invaded Lydia and defeated Gyges in battle. The Lydian king was killed, and his army suffered a major defeat. The basic outline is relatively clear, but beyond that, the details begin to disappear. Where exactly did Gyges die? The ancient records do not provide a precise battlefield location. Was he killed during a major confrontation near Sardis, or farther from the Lydian heartland? How large was his army? Did his troops collapse suddenly, or was the defeat part of a longer campaign? These questions remain difficult to answer. Later, Greek traditions provide additional information, but they were written long after Gyges' reign, and sometimes emphasize legendary elements. Herodotus remembers Gyges primarily through the dramatic story of his accession, while other classical traditions connect his dynasty with the wealth and power for which Lydia later became famous. The Assyrian evidence offers a different picture. Here, Gyges is not primarily a figure of palace intrigue. He is a foreign ruler operating within a dangerous international system, attempting to maneuver between powerful enemies and distant allies. His death may therefore have been the consequence of a political calculation that failed. Yet, even this interpretation contains uncertainties. Why did Gyges challenge Assyria after initially establishing diplomatic relations with Ashur-uballit? Did he genuinely believe Assyria was weakening? Was his support for Egypt an attempt to counterbalance Assyrian influence? Or did circumstances force him into an alliance he could not sustain? The ancient sources do not explain his motives. There is another intriguing possibility. The defeat of Gyges may have been remembered differently by different political traditions. For the Assyrians, his death demonstrated the consequences of opposing imperial authority. For the Lydians, it may have become a traumatic episode in the early history of their ruling dynasty. For later Greek writers, the event was absorbed into a broader narrative about the rise of Lydia. Each tradition preserved something different. None provides the complete picture. Archaeology has also struggled to illuminate Gyges' final moments. Sardis has revealed substantial evidence of Lydian society, including monumental structures, defensive remains, and artifacts demonstrating extensive contact with neighboring regions. Yet, no inscription has been found describing the precise circumstances of the king's death. His tomb is another matter of uncertainty. Several monumental burial mounds near Sardis have been associated with Lydian royalty, most famously the Bin Tepe Cemetery. But securely identifying a particular mound as Gyges' burial place remains difficult. Even if his burial site could be established, it would tell us little about the battlefield where he died. The contrast is striking. We know that a ruler named Gyges existed. We have independent evidence connecting him with Assyria. We know that Lydia faced the Cimmerian threat. And we have an ancient account indicating that Gyges died while resisting their invasion. But the final scene itself remains distant. Perhaps Gyges died leading his forces against an enemy that had repeatedly threatened Anatolia. Perhaps his defeat was the direct consequence of his decision to challenge Assyrian power. Or perhaps the political circumstances were more complicated than the surviving records suggest. The king who helped establish Lydia as a major regional power ultimately became another casualty of the turbulent world surrounding the Anatolian kingdoms. His death did not end the Lydian dynasty. The Mermnad line continued, and Lydia would eventually reach even greater prominence under Croesus. Yet the fate of its founder remains strangely incomplete. The Assyrian records preserve the starkest detail. Gyges fell in battle against the Cimmerians. But where the battle occurred, how the final moments unfolded, and whether his political choices led directly to his death, remain questions that the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. Somewhere between the royal archives of Assyria, the ruins of Sardis, and the windswept burial mounds of Lydia lies the final chapter of Gyges' life. And perhaps, beneath those ancient landscapes, evidence still waits to reveal how the king who rose through one of antiquity's most dramatic political upheavals ultimately met his end. The marble foundations of ancient Sardis lie beneath the hills of western Anatolia, surrounded by the remains of a kingdom whose wealth became legendary throughout the Greek world. Somewhere within this landscape, according to one of antiquity's most enduring stories, a wealthy king once received a visitor whose wisdom challenged everything he believed about prosperity and happiness. That king was Croesus, and his visitor was Solon of Athens. The story follows naturally from the uncertain death of Gyges. After generations of expansion, Lydia reached its greatest prominence under Croesus, the last great ruler of the Mermnad dynasty. His wealth became so famous that his name eventually entered language itself as a symbol of extraordinary riches. But the most famous episode involving Croesus may never have happened in the form later generations remembered. According to Herodotus, Solon visited Sardis during his travels after introducing important political reforms in Athens. Croesus welcomed the Athenian lawgiver into his palace and proudly displayed his enormous wealth. The king then asked Solon to identify the happiest man alive. Surely, Croesus seemed to assume, the answer would be obvious. He possessed immense riches, political power, a magnificent palace, and a kingdom that had become one of the dominant powers of Western Anatolia. Yet Solon did not name Croesus. Instead, he mentioned an Athenian named Tellus, followed by two brothers, Cleobus and Biton. Their lives, according to Solon's reasoning, were valuable because they were lived well and ended honorably. Croesus was reportedly disappointed. How could a man possessing such wealth not be considered the happiest person alive? Solon's response forms the philosophical heart of the story. No living person can be judged fortunate before the circumstances of an entire life are known. The statement was more than a criticism of wealth. It reflected a broader Greek idea that fortune could change suddenly, and that human beings possess little control over the final shape of their lives. Herodotus then connects this lesson directly to Croesus's fate. The Lydian king eventually went to war against Cyrus the Great. The campaign ended disastrously. Croesus was defeated, Sardis was captured, and the king was reportedly taken prisoner. At this point, Herodotus returns to the earlier conversation with Solon. Croesus, facing death, supposedly remembered the Athenians' warning and cried out Solon's name. Cyrus asked about the meaning of the strange utterance, and Croesus explained the lesson he had once received. The story continues with Cyrus reconsidering the fate of the defeated king. A fire had reportedly been prepared, and Croesus was placed upon it. As the flames approached, he called upon Apollo, and rain suddenly extinguished the fire. Cyrus, impressed by the event and by Croesus's earlier wisdom, spared his life. It is an extraordinary narrative, but historians face an immediate problem. There is no contemporary evidence confirming that Solon ever visited Croesus in Sardis. Solon certainly existed. His political career in Athens is well documented through later sources, and his poems survive in fragments. Croesus also unquestionably existed and ruled Lydia during the 6th century BC. The difficulty lies in the meeting itself. Herodotus was writing decades after the traditional date of Croesus's defeat, and his history was shaped not only by political events, but by moral themes. The conversation between Solon and Croesus fits perfectly within Herodotus's larger interest in fortune, pride, reversal, and the unpredictability of human life. This has led many scholars to regard the episode as a literary construction built around genuine historical figures. Yet, that does not necessarily make the story meaningless. It may preserve older traditions about Solon's travels or his reputation for wisdom. It may also reflect genuine diplomatic contact between Greek visitors and the Lydian court. Sardis was an international center, and Greek states maintained extensive connections with Lydia. The deeper question is whether Herodotus transformed fragments of historical memory into a carefully structured philosophical narrative. There are other uncertainties surrounding Croesus's final years. Different ancient traditions describe his fate in different ways. Some preserve the story of the pyre and miraculous reign, while others suggest that he survived and became an advisor to Cyrus. The Persian conquest itself is historically secure, but the exact circumstances surrounding Croesus's capture and subsequent life remain less certain. Archaeology confirms the grandeur of Sardis during the Lydian period. The city was wealthy, strategically located, and deeply connected to the wider Aegean and Near Eastern worlds. Coins associated with Lydia provide further evidence of the kingdom's sophisticated economic system. But archaeology cannot tell us whether Solon and Croesus sat together in a royal chamber discussing happiness. There is no inscription recording their conversation. No surviving document preserves Croesus's reaction. No contemporary account confirms Solon's journey to Lydia. The scene exists primarily through Herodotus, and yet its influence has been enormous. The story of Solon and Croesus became one of antiquity's most enduring reflections on wealth and fortune. It suggests that prosperity cannot be measured simply by possessions, power, or reputation. A life must be considered as a whole, and even then, the final judgment may remain beyond human control. Perhaps this explains why the story survived so powerfully. It is not merely about a king and a philosopher. It is about the instability of everything that appears permanent. Croesus possessed immense wealth, yet his kingdom fell. Solon possessed no comparable fortune, yet his words survived for centuries. And the conversation between them, whether historical, embellished, or entirely shaped by later storytelling, still raises an uncomfortable question. Did Solon truly warn Croesus in the halls of Sardis, or did Herodotus create the encounter to explain a deeper lesson about fortune? The ruins cannot answer. The wealth of Lydia has disappeared. The palace is silent, and the voices of the two men have survived only through later generations. Perhaps somewhere within that distance between history and memory lies the real mystery of Solon and Croesus, not whether the conversation happened exactly as described, but why an ancient historian felt compelled to preserve it, and what the story was intended to make us understand about the fragile nature of human fortune. The sun falls slowly over the island of Samos, illuminating the remains of walls, sanctuaries, and massive stone foundations scattered across a landscape that once belonged to one of the most ambitious rulers of the Aegean world. Near the ancient city of Samos, the ruins of the Heraeans still testify to an era of extraordinary wealth and construction. Somewhere within this prosperous island kingdom, a ruler named Polycrates built a reputation for power, fortune, and almost impossible success. And then, in a single political maneuver, that fortune came to an end. The story of Polycrates follows naturally from the tale of Solon and Croesus. Both narratives revolve around wealth and the unstable nature of power. But where Croesus's fate became a lesson preserved through philosophy, Polycrates' death became a story of political calculation, deception, and an apparent reversal of extraordinary fortune. Polycrates came to power on Samos during the 6th century BC, probably around 540 BC. The island occupied an important position in the eastern Aegean, close to the coast of Anatolia and the major maritime routes connecting the Greek world with the eastern Mediterranean. Under Polycrates, Samos became remarkably powerful. Ancient sources describe him as a ruler with a substantial fleet and an aggressive foreign policy. His ships operated across the Aegean, and Samos became an important center of trade and political influence. Herodotus presents Polycrates as a ruler who seemed unusually favored by fortune. His success became so consistent that it began to appear almost unnatural. One famous episode tells of a valuable ring that Polycrates deliberately threw into the sea. He supposedly feared that his extraordinary prosperity could not continue indefinitely, and believed that voluntarily surrendering something precious might restore balance to his fortune. Several days later, a fisherman presented the ruler with a large fish. When the fish was opened, Polycrates' ring was discovered inside. The event was interpreted as a remarkable sign, but Herodotus uses the story for a larger purpose. Polycrates' fortune, he suggests, had reached a point at which reversal was inevitable. Whether the ring episode preserves historical memory or literary symbolism is impossible to determine. Yet, Polycrates' political success is supported by the broader historical context. Samos possessed considerable maritime strength, and archaeological evidence confirms that the island experienced substantial prosperity during the 6th century BC. Polycrates also maintained relationships with powerful figures beyond the Aegean. Herodotus records a famous alliance between Polycrates and the Egyptian pharaoh Amasis. The two rulers supposedly exchanged gifts and maintained friendly relations, but Amasis became increasingly concerned about Polycrates' uninterrupted success. According to Herodotus, Amasis eventually warned his ally that excessive good fortune could provoke divine resentment. The Egyptian ruler advised Polycrates to deliberately surrender something he valued. Polycrates followed the advice by throwing his ring into the sea, and then the ring returned. For Amasis, this was deeply troubling. He reportedly concluded that Polycrates' extraordinary fortune could only end in disaster and withdrew from the friendship. Whether this exchange actually occurred cannot be established. It may reflect Greek ideas about fortune rather than a literal diplomatic conversation. Yet, the story introduces the central theme that dominates the account of Polycrates' death. Prosperity itself becomes a warning. The political circumstances were more concrete. At some point during the reign of Cambyses II, the Persian governor Oroetes controlled the region of Sardis. Herodotus portrays Oroetes as a dangerous and ambitious figure who became hostile toward Polycrates. The reasons remain uncertain. One ancient tradition suggests that Oroetes wanted to kill Polycrates because the Samian ruler had offended or threatened him. Another possibility is that the Persian governor saw an opportunity to eliminate a powerful independent ruler whose influence in the Aegean could become problematic. There may also have been a financial motive. Polycrates was extraordinarily wealthy. For a regional governor seeking greater influence, access to the resources of Samos would have been valuable. Whatever Oroetes' true motivation, he devised a plan to bring Polycrates within his reach. According to Herodotus, Oroetes sent a message to Samos claiming that he feared for his own life and wanted Polycrates' assistance. He also suggested that he possessed enormous wealth that he would share with the Samian ruler if Polycrates helped him escape Persian danger. Polycrates accepted the invitation. This decision would prove fatal. The Samian ruler traveled to Magnesia on the Maeander, a city in western Anatolia under Persian control. There, he entered the power of Oroetes. The circumstances of the encounter are difficult to reconstruct independently because the surviving account comes primarily through Herodotus. But the final event is described with grim clarity. Polycrates was seized and executed. Herodotus states that Oroetes had him killed by crucifixion, after which his body was displayed publicly. The man who had ruled one of the most prosperous islands in the Aegean was suddenly reduced to a symbol of political vulnerability. Yet, even here, uncertainty remains. Why did Polycrates trust Oroetes? He was an experienced ruler who had survived political competition and built an impressive maritime power. He understood the dangers of Persian authority and had every reason to approach a Persian governor cautiously. Perhaps the promise of wealth convinced him. Perhaps Polycrates believed Oroetes was genuinely seeking protection. Or perhaps the political situation was more complicated than Herodotus' account suggests. There may have been negotiations, rival factions, or diplomatic pressures that have disappeared from the surviving record. The geography of the episode is also significant. Polycrates left the safety of Samos and traveled to the mainland, entering a political environment controlled by the Persian Empire. On his island, he possessed ships, fortifications, wealth, and loyal supporters. On the mainland, he was dependent upon the hospitality of a man who ultimately betrayed him. The journey itself may therefore have been the decisive mistake. But what happened to Samos after his death? The island did not disappear from history. Polycrates' regime ended, but Samos remained an important political and cultural center. His death created a new struggle for authority, and Persian influence continued to shape the region. Oroetes himself would not enjoy lasting security. Eventually, Darius the Great ordered his removal. Herodotus describes the Persian governor being eliminated after Darius became concerned about his independent behavior and growing wealth. This creates an intriguing symmetry. Oroetes, who had used deception to destroy Polycrates, eventually became a victim of political maneuvering himself. But the historical record surrounding Polycrates contains more than political intrigue. His reign left an important archaeological legacy. The great temple of Hera at Samos was expanded dramatically during the 6th century BC. Monumental construction projects demonstrate the wealth available to the Samian state, while the island's artistic and maritime connections reveal a society deeply integrated into the wider Mediterranean world. Polycrates was therefore not merely a figure from a moral tale. He was a genuine ruler who presided over a powerful maritime state during a period of enormous geopolitical change. Yet his reputation was shaped by the way his life ended. Herodotus presents Polycrates as almost impossibly fortunate until the moment when fortune reversed itself. The ring that returned from the sea becomes a symbol of this pattern. Even an attempt to surrender prosperity could not interrupt the ruler's success. But perhaps there is another way to understand the story. The ring may have been a literary device used to prepare the audience for Polycrates' eventual downfall. Herodotus may have constructed the narrative so that the final catastrophe appeared inevitable. If so, the story tells us as much about Greek attitudes toward fortune as it does about Polycrates himself. The ancient Greeks often recognized that prosperity could create vulnerability. Wealth attracted rivals. Political power created enemies. Success encouraged confidence, and confidence could lead rulers into dangerous decisions. Polycrates may not have been destroyed by fate in any supernatural sense. He may simply have made a political calculation that proved disastrous. And yet the precise reason he trusted Zoroaster remains beyond recovery. Was the Samian ruler deceived by the promise of enormous wealth? Did he believe that Persian politics offered an opportunity rather than a threat? Was he acting under pressure from rivals or allies whose names have disappeared from the record? And what did Polycrates understand about the danger as he traveled toward Magnesia? We cannot know. No surviving inscription records his final thoughts. No contemporary witness account describes the meeting with Zoroaster in detail. The archaeological remains of Samos reveal the scale of Polycrates' power, but not the decision that carried him away from it. The sea around Samos remains much as it was in antiquity, stretching between the island and the Anatolian coast. Merchant ships and warships once crossed these waters carrying wealth, soldiers, diplomats, and messages between competing powers. The sun settles over the broad ruins of Babylon, turning the broken bricks of its ancient walls a muted gold. Once, this was the heart of a kingdom whose influence stretched across Mesopotamia, a city of monumental gates, temples, processional roads, and royal palaces. Among the rulers who occupied its throne was Amel-Marduk, a king whose reign lasted only a few years and ended with an abrupt transfer of power. His story follows naturally from the fate of Polycrates of Samos. Once again, wealth, royal authority, and political calculation converge around a ruler whose final years remain difficult to reconstruct. But in the case of Amel-Marduk, there is an important distinction. His disappearance from power is not entirely unexplained. Ancient sources strongly indicate that he was assassinated. What remains uncertain is why. Amel-Marduk, whose name means roughly "man of Marduk," succeeded Nebuchadnezzar II, the most famous ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar had ruled Babylon for more than 4 decades, transforming the city into one of the greatest capitals of the ancient Near East. His death around 562 BC created an immediate succession. The throne passed to his son, Amel-Marduk. Yet the new king inherited more than an empire. He inherited the legacy of a powerful father, a complicated royal court, and a political system in which the loyalty of influential officials could never be taken for granted. Only a small number of years separate Amel-Marduk's accession from his death. Babylonian administrative documents provide evidence that he was a functioning monarch. Legal and economic texts dated to his reign demonstrate that government continued normally. Royal authority was being exercised, officials were conducting transactions, and the machinery of the Babylonian state remained intact. But outside these practical records, Amel-Marduk's personal history is remarkably difficult to reconstruct. Later classical writers provide some of the more dramatic details. Croesus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Babylon in the Hellenistic period, reportedly described Amel-Marduk as an unpopular ruler who was eventually murdered by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. Other later traditions are less generous. Josephus, drawing upon earlier sources, preserves claims that Amel-Marduk was considered unsuitable for kingship and had behaved in ways that angered powerful members of the court. Some accounts portray him as morally corrupt or politically ineffective. But how much of this should be accepted? The distance between the events and the surviving literary accounts is substantial. Later historians had access to traditions that are now lost, but their descriptions may also have been shaped by political judgments and retrospective narratives. The Babylonian documents offer a quieter picture. They do not portray a kingdom collapsing into chaos. They simply record the routine activities of government under a king who would soon be dead. This contrast is important. If Amel-Marduk was truly despised by the population, the surviving administrative record does not clearly reveal widespread unrest. If his court was consumed by conspiracy, the surviving tablets provide few details about the conflict. Then, after roughly 2 years on the throne, Amel-Marduk disappears from the royal record. Neriglissar becomes king. The transition appears to have been violent. According to the later historical tradition, Neriglissar killed Amel-Marduk and seized the throne. He was not an obvious continuation of Nebuchadnezzar's direct line, although he was closely connected to the royal family through marriage. This raises the central question. Was Amel-Marduk murdered because of personal hostility within the royal family, or was his assassination part of a broader political struggle over the future of Babylon? The answer may lie partly in Neriglissar's position. Neriglissar had been an important official during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He possessed wealth, influence, and connections within the court. His marriage into the royal family further strengthened his political standing. If Amel-Marduk attempted to weaken powerful officials or redistribute influence, tensions could have developed quickly. Some later sources suggest that the new king had personal reasons for opposing Amel-Marduk. Others have interpreted the succession as evidence of a broader conflict between competing factions within the Babylonian elite. Neither explanation can be proven conclusively. There is, however, an intriguing piece of evidence from the royal record. Amel-Marduk is known to have released Jehoiachin, the former king of Judah, from imprisonment in Babylon. After years of confinement, Jehoiachin was granted a more favorable position at court. This act is historically significant, but its political meaning remains uncertain. Was it an act of clemency? Was Amel-Marduk attempting to change his father's policies? Or was it part of a broader strategy to build a different political coalition? The available evidence does not tell us. What we do know is that Amel-Marduk's reign differed in certain respects from that of Nebuchadnezzar. His rule was brief, and his death brought a rapid change in leadership. The palace itself would have been a world of competing interests. Behind the monumental walls of Babylon, royal authority depended upon generals, priests, administrators, wealthy families, and provincial officials. The king stood at the center of this system, but his position was never completely isolated from those around him. An unpopular decision could create opposition. A succession dispute could become dangerous. A marriage alliance could alter the balance of power. and the death of a king could transform all of these tensions overnight. Neriglissar's accession therefore deserves careful attention. Rather than simply replacing Amel-Marduk, he represented a different branch of the political order. His reign lasted approximately 4 years, during which he undertook military campaigns and major building activities. The Babylonian state continued. This continuity is revealing. There was no prolonged collapse after Amel-Marduk's death. Babylon remained powerful, its temples remained active, and its administration continued to function. That makes the assassination appear less like the destruction of the state and more like a change within the ruling elite. But even this interpretation has limits. The surviving records are uneven. Royal inscriptions naturally emphasize achievements rather than conspiracies. Administrative tablets preserve transactions rather than private conversations. Later, historians preserve stories that may contain genuine memories, but those stories cannot always be independently verified. The result is a historical puzzle built from different kinds of evidence. The documents show a functioning king. The later traditions describe an unpopular ruler. The succession suggests a violent political transition, and the absence of detailed contemporary accounts leaves the motives largely uncertain. There are more speculative possibilities. Perhaps Amel-Marduk attempted reforms that threatened powerful interests. Perhaps his relationship with the priesthood or military elite deteriorated. Perhaps a faction within the royal family believed that another ruler would better protect its position. Some interpretations have even suggested that his short reign reflected a deliberate struggle over succession that began during Nebuchadnezzar's final years. Yet there is no decisive evidence establishing any of these scenarios. The most cautious conclusion is simpler. Amel-Marduk ruled Babylon for a brief period after the death of his powerful father. He appears to have maintained the machinery of government, but he was removed from the throne around 560 BC, probably through assassination. Neriglissar succeeded him and consolidated his own authority. But the precise circumstances remain obscure. There is something haunting about the silence surrounding the end of his reign. Babylon was a city that recorded almost everything: contracts, property transfers, astronomical observations, religious offerings, taxes, royal building projects, and political events. Clay tablets accumulated in temples and administrative archives, preserving fragments of daily life for thousands of years. And yet the final moments of one of Babylon's kings remain largely beyond recovery. Somewhere within the royal court, a decision was made. A group of powerful men may have concluded that Amel-Marduk could no longer remain on the throne. Whether the king knew that danger was approaching, whether he attempted to resist, and whether his death came suddenly or followed a longer political confrontation, are questions the surviving evidence cannot answer. Perhaps the later accusations against him preserve genuine memories of his conduct. Perhaps they were written to justify the actions of those who replaced him. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the two. Today, the ruins of Babylon offer no direct testimony. The great palace complexes are silent, and the political world that once surrounded Amel-Marduk has disappeared beneath layers of time. His reign lasted only a brief interval between the long rule of Nebuchadnezzar II and the rise of Neriglissar. Yet that short interval contains a much larger question. Was Amel-Marduk simply an unsuccessful successor whose enemies removed him from power, or was his assassination the visible result of a deeper struggle within the Babylonian royal house? The evidence tells us that the king disappeared from power. It strongly suggests that he was killed, but it does not tell us who truly feared him, what they hoped to gain, or what happened inside the palace when the fate of Babylon's king was decided.